They laughed the way institutions laugh, polished, public, and certain that the sound itself was evidence. The amphitheater at Calais Station's Institute of Xenophilology was built to magnify that kind of confidence. Every seat rose in neat, lacquered tiers, every acoustic panel tuned to make a single voice ring like truth. Under the dome, the relic slab stood upright in a cradle of gravitic braces, its surface lit by three white lamps that stripped away shadow and romance. The symbols carved into it looked like an argument between scratches and geometry. Hooks that ended too neatly, wedges that repeated in clusters, little squares nested inside long strokes. To the Institute's senior scholars, it was the kind of thing you displayed as proof of how much work remained. Professor Vera Lon, the chair of Dead Script Studies, swept a hand toward the slab as if unveiling a masterpiece. As you can see, she said, the so-called irradiant table is a perfect example of ritual mark-making without semantic content. The patterns repeat, yes. The grooves are uniform, yes. But there is no evidence of phonemic structure, no syntactic indicators, no determinatives, no contextual artifacts beyond the slab itself. The laughter started in the back rows where the doctoral candidates sat. It traveled forward like a wave finding a shoreline. Perhaps someone called, "It's a hymn to boredom," more laughter. On the floor level beside the Institute's docents and assistants, Elias Rook kept his hands folded behind his back and tried to look like he belonged in a room where everyone wore ceremonial collars and spoke as if their opinions had tenure. He had a different uniform, expedition grays stained at the cuffs with a survey patch sewn crookedly onto the shoulder. He was here under the Institute's new interdisciplinary outreach initiative, which was how the administrators described, "We promised the funding council we'd invite people who don't worship the same altar." Elias wasn't a philologist. He wasn't even an archaeologist by original training. He was a systems analyst turned salvage contractor turned, by necessity, pattern hunter. He had spent the last 6 months on a dead moon, cataloging shattered vaults and melted conduits, looking for anything that explained why the Lyran Gate civilization had collapsed without leaving a readable word behind. He'd been told to attend this presentation because the relic slab was from the same vault complex, because the email had said the Institute valued fresh eyes. Fresh eyes, he thought, were easy to invite when you didn't intend to listen to what they saw. Professor Lon continued. There is, of course, a romantic impulse to assign meaning to the unknown. Some have proposed these symbols represent a calendar, others a prayer. One particularly imaginative paper suggested it is a map of the Lyran Gate's afterlife pathways. She smiled as if indulging a child's drawing. Yet the simplest explanation remains: these are senseless. A second wave of laughter rolled through the seats. Elias' gaze stayed on the slab. Not because he expected the room to stop laughing, but because something in the marks tightened like a knot in his mind. Clusters, columns, repetition with variation. His eyes traced one vertical band of carvings. A hook-like symbol appeared once. Beneath it, the same hook appeared twice, paired with a small notch. Beneath that, the hook appeared 3 times, but the notch shifted position. Not random, not decorative. He leaned slightly to the left, aligning the carvings with the lamp's glare. The grooves were deep where a tool had bitten repeatedly, lighter where a hand had been tentative. Some strokes were corrected, Ray carved, as if someone had made a mistake and tried to fix it. Errors corrected. He had seen that in only one kind of writing, not names, not prayers, accounting. Professor Lon nodded toward an assistant. We will now open the floor for questions, provided they are informed. More laughter, smaller, sharper. Elia's throat felt too dry for the word forming there. He didn't raise his hand at first. He waited, watching the ritual of scholarly dominance unfold. A student asked about possible phonetic parallels. Lon dismissed it. Another suggested comparing the symbols to known gate cult iconography. Lon praised the effort and dismantled it in 3 sentences. A third asked whether machine learning models had detected linguistic structure. Lon waved a hand. We do not outsource thinking to pattern engines. Elias exhaled. He raised his hand anyway. It was an ordinary human gesture, but in the amphitheater it looked like a trespass. Professor Lon's eyes landed on him. They were a pale, reflective shade common to her species, giving the impression she was always staring at you through a thin sheet of ice. Yes, she said, and the word carried the tone of someone granting permission for a small animal to speak. Elias cleared his throat. I'm Elias Rook. I was on the salvage team at Vault Complex 9. A few heads turned. Not respectful, curious, like a room watching a maintenance worker step onto the stage. I'm not a philologist, he said, but I think these symbols are numbers. Silence fell in a way laughter never could, sudden and sharp, as if the room had been switched off. Then somewhere in the middle tier, someone made a sound halfway between a snort and a cough. The laughter returned, louder than before. Professor Lon didn't laugh. She didn't need to. She waited until the room had finished enjoying itself. Numbers, she repeated. How charmingly human. You see digits everywhere. Clocks, ledgers, scores, very well, explain. There it was, the invitation wrapped in a trap. Elias stepped forward a half-pace. The gravitic braces hummed softly around the slab. Up close, the carvings were more precise than the hollows made them seem. The symbols weren't just repeated, they were aligned. Aligned like place value. He pointed to the leftmost column. At symbol, this wedge with the short tail appears in clusters from 1 to 9, but it never appears 10 times. When the count would reach 10, the next column changes. A scholar near the front scoffed. You are imposing base 10 bias. Maybe, Elias said evenly. So let's not assume base 10. Let's assume there is a base, any base. What matters is carry behavior. He moved his finger carefully along a row. Here, you get 4 of the wedge marks, then a different symbol appears in the next column. The wedge marks reset to 1, that's a carry, and it repeats consistently. Professor Lon's expression didn't change, but the laughter had thinned. Curiosity is harder to suppress than amusement. Elias continued. Also, these marks have correction strokes. See this groove? It's been recut to change the count. People correct numbers when the totals matter. Another scholar, older, with a metal ring embedded along his jawline, leaned forward. If you are correct, what is the base? Elias paused. He hadn't planned to be right in public. Being right was usually something you did quietly in a corner where it couldn't offend anyone. He scanned the slab, the clusters, the carry points, the repeating sequences, the frequency of symbols. 8, he said finally. I think it's base 8. A ripple moved through the hall, less laughter, more murmuring. Professor Lon tilted her head. On what grounds? Elias swallowed. Because the wedge symbol appears up to 7 times before the carry. I've counted every occurrence in the first band. The maximum cluster is 7, then the next column increments. That suggests the lowest place cycles 0 through 7. And 0, Professor Lon asked, almost bored again. Your theory requires a 0. Elias nodded. It's here. He pointed to a small square carved alone in a position where other rows had wedge clusters. It appears in the lowest place only, he said, and whenever it appears, the higher places still change in a way consistent with an empty unit position. A student laughed nervously. A square means nothing, it could be decoration. It could, Elias said, but it behaves like 0. Professor Lon stepped down from her lectern and approached the slab. That alone quieted the room. She studied the square with a critical stillness, her fingers hovering but not touching. Assuming, she said, for the sake of argument that your numerical hypothesis is not entirely fanciful. What does it say? Elias' heart thumped once hard. That was the real question. Numbers aren't just quantities. They are instructions, coordinates, dates, warnings written in the language of inevitability. He took a breath and looked at the rightmost band of carvings, the one he'd been unable to stop staring at since the moment he walked in. The marks there were denser, the strokes deeper. Whoever carved them had pressed hard, as if afraid the stone would forget. There are repeated sequences, he said, that look like computed values, like tables. Tables of what? Someone demanded. Elias traced the band, ratios, cycles. There's a pattern that matches roughly what you'd expect if you were tracking orbital periods or reactor harmonics. Or he stopped because his mind had made the leap before his mouth could. There were 3 numbers repeating at the top of the band. A large value. A slightly smaller one, then a repeating remainder, division, modulo, a schedule, a lock, a system that required alignment. He turned toward Professor Lon. Do you have the context from where this slab was found? Professor Lon's lips pressed together. Vault Complex 9, Inner Ring, Chamber 3, beneath the collapsed array. Yes, that is known. Elias nodded slowly. Then this isn't a calendar, it's not a hymn, it's a key. The word hit the room like a dropped tool. Professor Lon's voice sharpened. Explain. Elias stepped toward the projection console and without waiting for permission tapped the interface. A hollow sprang up, an image of the vault chamber as recorded by the salvage team. A circular door sealed, ringed with notches and symbols that matched the slab's shapes. Gasps flickered through the audience. Some had seen the hollows, many had not. The Institute rationed raw expedition data like currency. Elias highlighted the door's outer ring. These notches correspond to the same symbol set. The slab is a reference, a numeric reference. A scholar stood abruptly. Are you claiming the vault door is combinatorial? Yes, Elias said, or algorithmic. It may not be a simple code. It could require setting a sequence based on computed values, timed cycles, positions, alignments. Professor Lon's eyes narrowed. You have not opened this door. No, Elias admitted. We didn't have the authority. We were told to extract movable artifacts and leave the rest sealed. A low murmur of discontent moved through the amphitheater. Scholars hated being reminded that someone else controlled the keys to their obsessions. Elias kept going because once you've stepped onto the blade, the only way off is forward. But if these are numbers, he said, we can test it right now. Give me 1 hour with your assistants and a scanner. I can map the symbol set to numeric values, verify base 8, and generate candidate sequences, not guesses, computed sequences. Professor Lon stared at him for a long moment. The silence was no longer dismissive. It was weighing, then she turned toward the audience. Is there any among you, she asked, who can refute his claims immediately? No one spoke, not because they agreed, but because refutation required evidence and Elias had done the one unforgivable thing. He had offered a method. Professor Lon's chin lifted. Very well, we will indulge this exercise. The laughter did not return. It had found something else to become. They gave him a workroom beneath the amphitheater in the institute sublevel where the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper. Two assistants accompanied him, one silent, one openly resentful. The scanner hummed as it traced the slab, capturing depth and angle, recording every correction stroke and tool mark. Elias sketched mappings on a glass panel. Wedge with tail, 1 2 wedges, 2. 7 wedges, 7 square, 0 the carry symbol and angular hook behaved like 8 in base 8 incrementing the next column. But then he hit the second band and the system widened. There were symbols that appeared only in higher places, not simple digits, operators, a mark that always sat between two number clusters, a divider, a plus, a transform. He felt his pulse quicken not from triumph but from the dangerous thrill of recognizing a mind at work across centuries. These weren't random scratches. This was a civilization that had built abstract scaffolding and used it to hold reality still long enough to shape it. The silent assistant, Keth, leaned closer at one point, unable to stop herself. That mark, she said, pointing, it repeats every 8 rows. Elias nodded. It's an iteration marker, like next, or it's indexing a table. The resentful assistant, Morrow, crossed his arms. Even if you are correct, how does this help us interpret their culture? We study language, meaning, not arithmetic. Elias didn't look up. Numbers are meaning, he said. They're just meaning without a mouth. By the time the hour was up, he had something he could show without hand waving, a consistent digit system, a zero, place values, and a set of repeating sequences that matched the structure of computed tables. Professor Lon arrived with 2 senior faculty members and a security officer whose presence made everything feel less like scholarship and more like custody. Elias projected his findings onto the wall. This, he said, is the digit set. This is carry behavior. This is the operator mark that separates inputs from outputs. Professor Lon watched, expression tight. And the key. Elias switched projections to the vault door hollow and overlaid the symbol ring with numeric values. The door ring has 8 positions, he said, 8 notches, 8 state alignment. The slab provides values that likely correspond to the correct setting of those positions. One of the senior faculty, a thin being with ocular frills that fluttered when it was intrigued, whispered base 8 because the mechanism itself is octant-based. Elias nodded. The physical design matches the math, that's not coincidence. Professor Lon's voice was carefully neutral. You will provide your mapping to the institute. It wasn't a request. Elias met her gaze. And will the institute provide it to the salvage team who actually has access to the door? Professor Lon's eyes hardened. The institute will determine proper dissemination. The security officer shifted slightly, a silent reminder of power. Elias felt the old familiar anger, slow, controlled. He had seen too many artifacts vanish into locked archives while people on the ground risked their lives for scraps of recognition. So he did what he'd learned to do in salvage yards and data centers and hostile boardrooms. He offered value that came with terms. I'll share the mapping, he said, but I'm going back to Vault Complex 9 with Institute representation. We open the door together, Morrow scoffed. You overstep. Elias shrugged, though his hands were sweating. Maybe, but if these are numbers and this is a key, you'll want to be there when it turns. Professor Lon's mouth tightened as if tasting something unpleasant. Then after a pause long enough to be political, she said, agreed, under oversight. The word oversight carried its own chain. Elias nodded anyway. Fine. Because the door mattered more than pride. The vault moon was colder than memory. Its horizon was a jagged line of broken structures, once a shining complex, now a skeleton of alloy ribs and collapsed halls. The air inside the excavation dome tasted metallic, recycled too many times. Floodlights cast harsh shadows over ancient stone. The sealed door waited at the inner ring, exactly where the hollow had shown it. Up close, it was more imposing, a circle of dark material that seemed to swallow light, ringed with 8 adjustable plates, each engraved with the same symbol set as the slab. Professor Lon stood beside Elias in a pressurized suit, her posture stiff with contained excitement. Behind her, 3 institute technicians set up monitoring equipment. The salvage team watched from a respectful distance, distrustful of academics but unwilling to miss history. Elias approached the ring and touched the first plate. It moved with smooth resistance, clicking as it passed each symbol. 8 states, he murmured. Good. He pulled up his computed sequence on his wrist display. The table values on the slab suggested an alignment based on a cycle, 3 interacting numbers like gears. He set the first plate to the square, 0. The second to the symbol corresponding to 5. The third to 2. Each click sounded too loud. Professor Lon's voice came through comms. If this fails, the Institute will hold you responsible for damage. Elias didn't bother responding. He set the 4th plate, then the 5th. As he reached the 8th, his mind flickered to the hands that had carved the slab. Someone had pressed hard, correcting mistakes, carving deeper as if to insist the numbers survive. Why insist? Because the door mattered. Because whatever lay behind it mattered enough to leave a numeric key where language could fail. Elias set the final plate and stepped back. Nothing happened. A quiet collective breath held in the dome. Elias stared at the ring. His mapping was correct. The base was correct. The structure was correct. Unless the values weren't static. Unless they were not a single key but a function. He looked down at the slab sequence again. The repeating remainder, the modulo behavior. A timing component. Elias' eyes snapped to the vault chamber's ceiling where a damaged array still hung, an old field emitter inert but intact. Power, he said into comms. This needs a pulse, a cycle marker. Professor Lon frowned. You did not mention that. I didn't see it until now, Elias said. The table includes a phase offset. It's not just positions, it's positions at a time. The salvage chief, a broad-shouldered woman named Hara, stepped forward. We can feed it a controlled pulse from our portable cells. Professor Lon's immediate response was predictable. No, that is reckless. Hara's visor turned toward Elias. Is it necessary? Elias hesitated for half a second, the only honest hesitation he could afford. Yes, he said, but controlled, low energy, like waking up a lock, not forcing a door. Hara nodded once. Do it. The Institute technicians began protesting. The salvage crew began wiring. Elias watched the ring, heart thudding, as a small line of power fed into the ancient array. Indicators on the portable cell flickered. The chamber's air tingled faintly like the moment before static snaps. The ring's symbols glowed, not brightly, just enough to reveal they had always been meant to be seen, not merely carved. A soft tone sounded deep and resonant like stone humming. Then the door moved. It didn't swing. It unfolded, segments rotating inward with a precision that made the ruin around it seem even more tragic by contrast. Inside was darkness, and then light, cold, steady, as if the chamber had been waiting. Elias' mouth went dry. Professor Lon went still, every ounce of scholarly pride replaced by the raw hunger of discovery. They stepped through. The inner chamber was not a treasure vault. It was not a shrine. It was a data room, rows of crystalline columns arranged like a forest of frozen lightning. In the center, a pedestal held a single plate of the same dark stone as the door, etched with symbols. Different symbols, not digits, not operators, but something that made Elias' stomach tighten. A sequence of numbers followed by a symbol that, by placement and repetition, looked like the only word the Lyran Gate civilization had trusted enough to carve in stone. A warning. Professor Lon approached the pedestal with reverence. At last, she whispered. Language. Elias stared at the numbers instead. He knew what they were before he translated them. They were not a date, not a count. They were a measure, a threshold. Those numbers, Elias said quietly, match the harmonic cycle table. They're a limit value. Professor Lon's eyes flicked to him. Meaning? Elias swallowed. meaning this chamber isn't sealed to protect what's inside from us. He looked at the door behind them, now closed, its ring still faintly lit. It's sealed to protect us from what's inside. Silence, again different from the amphitheater. This silence wasn't about pride, it was about survival. Hara's voice crackled through comms from outside. What do you see? Elias took a slow breath. A date, a core, and a warning. Professor Lon stepped closer to the etched symbol, eyes shining. We can decode it now, we have the numeric key, we can map the rest. Elias didn't argue, he didn't have to, because the numbers had already done what words couldn't, they had made the room stop laughing. On Calith Station weeks later, the Institute published a revised paper. It was elegant, cautious, and careful to distribute credit like a controlled substance. It acknowledged numeric structure. It suggested possible computational purpose. It recommended further study. No one laughed during the presentation, not because the scholars had become humble overnight, but because the slab had taught them something language rarely does. That meaning can exist without permission. That a civilization can carve truth into stone so deeply that even arrogance cannot sand it away. And that sometimes the most dangerous sentence ever written begins, not with a word, but with a number.